Hi guys and welcome back to my channel. Now today we are talking about Sabaj A10d. Now this is a 2022 edition because I do believe there was like an older version of A10d, previous one it looked differently, but this one is the refreshed model and today we'll talk about it. How does it sound, how does it work, is it worth its price, etc. And to start with the pricing, this unit costs $300 well, $299 to be really precise. And this is a DAC/headphone amplifier, so it's a two-in-one device. And as you can see in the front, we have a display, then volume knob, and two headphone outputs. The lower one is 6.35mm single-ended, and the upper one is 4.4 pentacon, that's balanced output. And in the back you can see there is AC power inlet, meaning that the power supply is located inside of the unit, that's why it's a little bit bigger and heftier. Next to it there is a Bluetooth antenna, so you can connect to this unit wirelessly, then USB-C port, then optical input and coaxial SPDIF input over RCA. So as you can see, you're pretty covered with digital inputs. On the output side of things, we have RCA connectors, that's single-ended output, and then XLRs, which is balanced output. Tech specs, they look peachy, everything's fine. They used two of Sabre DAC chips, then you have plenty of power, like 1 watt at 32 ohms, which doubles at 16 ohms, but who would need 2 watts in 16 ohms? And the power slightly decreases the higher impedance headphones you're using, which is quite normal. But I just wanted to say that these kind of numbers mean in real life that you have plenty of power for basically any sort of headphone. And if there are some beasts that would require more power than this, there are probably some really high-end weird stuff that you wouldn't be connecting to this unit anyway. So regarding power, you're covered. Regarding specs, you're covered. Two Sabre DAC chips, it can handle basically all formats, high sample rate, PCM, DSD, and so on. I don't see that MKII is supported, so no MKII support on this one. Oh, just before I talk about the sound, using this unit is fairly simple. There is a remote, you can do everything using this scroll button and click button at the same time. You can basically choose low gain or high gain, several different digital filters, and basically that's it. There is not much to talk about here. It's simple and functional UI. Just if you used any of the recent modern DACs, that's it. There are no surprises, there is nothing to be excited about, also nothing to be worried about. Display has big, white, very readable digits, I like that. And the design itself, yeah, it's a matter of taste, but it's built quite well. It's made completely out of aluminum. It has these weird handles that are actually probably meant to remind you on high-end, heavy stereo equipment, because some integrated amps or power amps, traditional one meant to power your speakers, are so heavy and also have really sharp heat sinks on the sides that it's difficult to handle them without these handles that you can take them and carry them around. That's probably like class A amps, because those are really bulky, heavy, and have huge heat sinks. And that makes these kind of handles really practical on those amps. Here it's purely aesthetic because this is a small unit and does not have sharp heatsinks, so this is aesthetics. If you like it or not, write down below in the comments. I'm interested to know your opinion on this. For me, I'm quite okay with it. I don't like them particularly, but I don't mind them either. So now let's move to the sound fidelity. How does this DAC/amp sound? And first I've tested it with several headphones, and in isolation I thought to myself, this sounds very detailed. Mid-range is prominent and very revealing. It's not overly sharp in my opinion, but there is not much warmth, and if you like a lot of bloom and warm sounds, you're probably not going to fall in love with this head-amp. But control over the bass line is great. Bass itself is punchy, it goes plenty deep, and this really does have quite a bit of power. So anything I've connected to it felt like having enough drive, enough dynamics, enough zest and liveliness in the sound. Also, layering and separation of the instrument is top-notch, I can say. And that made me want to compare it to several other DAC head-amps that I had at hand. So first I started with cheaper FX Audio DAC M1. And as soon as I started listening to that one, I've noticed that it sounds a little bit milder and not as alive, not as kicky and as dynamic as A10d here. You definitely feel that with it, with FX Audio, you have not as much power as with this one. And that feels as a slightly flatter sound, less involving, especially dynamically less involving sound. In terms of just detail retrieval, DAC M1 is pretty good on its own, but this one is better. I do not have topping DX3 Pro Plus with me anymore, that was just a loan, but I would say that this Sabaj and that topping are roughly on the equal footing when it comes to detail retrieval. But to my ears, I would bet that A10d sounds a little bit fuller and a little bit more substantial in the mid-range. So to quickly sum this section up, it's definitely a clear step up from FX Audio DAC M1, both in terms of just power and drive, but also it's a little bit more detailed and fuller, richer sounding in the mid-range. While bassline has more drive, more kick, more impact with this one. And yeah, it does cost a little bit more, but I think it's well worth that price difference. Compared to topping DX3 Pro Plus, I'll not make any definite conclusions because, as I said, I don't have that unit with me anymore, but I do feel that this one is equally revealing and equally lively and punchy and engaging, while at the same time offering a bit thicker and fuller sound compared to DX3 Pro Plus. That's, from my memory, and comparing these two with several other devices, I feel that DX3 Pro Plus is definitely thinner and leaner sounding, less tonally correct. I would call this one more neutral sounding, and again, I would prefer using this one. Next, I've compared it to SMSL M500 MKII, but in this duel, M500 MKII definitely holds its ground and it sounds slightly fuller in the mid-range and just slightly warmer, slightly more full-bodied than Sabaj. In a direct comparison, A10d will sound a little bit drier and just a little bit more analytical, whereas SMSL M500 MKII will fill out mid-range with just a little bit more body and juice. The difference is not huge, but it's there and you can hear it. Everything else, dynamics, detail retrieval, just soundstage, separation, is basically equal on both, and it's pretty great. But remember, now I'm talking about headphone outputs only. I'll get to the DAC section quite soon. And lastly, I compared A10d with this SMSL stack, which consists of DO100 and HO100. And this stack is more expensive than A10d here, but there's no beating around the bush here. It sounds a little more engaging, livelier, and it has more grunt in the bass, and again fuller mid-bass that gives more body and more palpability to all tones and the whole mid-range. So you do get slightly punchier, slightly livelier and fuller sound from this stack than you do from A10d. But this stack is more expensive, requires more cables and so on. And if you're wondering why am I not comparing layering, sound staging and just separation of the instrument, all of that is basically equal across the board on A10d, on this SMSL stack, on this SMSL M500 MK2. They're equally resolving and revealing of mid-range details, of high-frequency details. They all sound quite neutral to my ears, quite smooth without much sharpness and edginess or anything annoying in that way. But the biggest difference is actually tonal one that I've explained, and slightly in terms of dynamics and punchiness. And both of these go to SMSL M500 MK2 by a smaller margin, and then SMSL stack by a slightly bigger margin. So in this company, which is admittedly more expensive one, A10d does sound a little bit drier and just less full-bodied, but equally resolving. Now let's move to the line output, which is just a DAC part without a headphone out, if you are more interested in that. When you listen to it and you are not comparing it to anything else, you hear pretty good dynamics, pretty good bass and drive, and there's a very reasonable amount of detail retrieval and texture that you can hear on top of each tone. Sound staging is good, but it's nothing to write home about. It's basically on pair with other good Sabre-based DACs, meaning that you have like reasonably wide, reasonably deep sound stage, but it's not going to be as wide and as airy and as relaxed as some better AK-based DACs, or R2Rs of course. But if you compare it to other good Sabre DACs near this price point, it will not disappoint you. And inside of that moderately sized soundstage, you have a really decent, good placement of instruments and singer, and they're well separated and have good focus. So I went on and compared it in my stereo setup with several other DACs. So what I found out is that its sound is really closely matched to the sound of SMSL DO100, which is just slightly cheaper, but it's only a DAC. This one does not have a headphone amp. So if you want this level of performance on the line outputs, then Sabaj A10d will provide that. But for those additional $50 that you paid for it, you'll get a headphone output if you ever need one, bundled and included. As you saw from my previous comparison, that headphone output is not as good as a dedicated HO100 amp. It's not as lively sounding and as punchy, but it's pretty good for the money, considering that you're getting a DAC section that equals DO100, and then only for $50 extra, you get a pretty decent and usable headphone output too. Then I went on and compared line outputs, DAC sections, of A10d with SMSL M500 MK2. And you all already probably know that I really like this one as a DAC. It sounds full and juicy and smooth and palpable, and I just loved the sound of this unit as a DAC. And A10d cannot really and fully match the sound fidelity of this SMSL, in my opinion. In many aspects, they are quite on the same level. For example, detail retrieval, pretty much comparable. Sound staging, pretty much equal width and equal depth. But whereas SMSL M500 MK2 takes a lead is just in that sense that it sounds more full-bodied, which gives more realistic weight to tones. And I always repeat that tones and vocals, instruments, they become more palpable because you feel like there is more body to them, and it just feels more lifelike and more 3D in space. A10d has a sound that's maybe closer to topping DACs, but not the topping DACs of old that were quite thin and flat sounding, but we are talking about topping DACs from more recent times. For example, a DAC in topping DX5 that again broke down, so I couldn't compare them directly, but I believe this one would be a pretty good match to a line output, DAC output from a DX5. It feels like it's roughly, technically speaking, on the same level with M500 MK2, but to my ears and how I feel about their tonality, it's not really there, because it does sound a little bit drier, a little bit leaner, whereas M500 MK2 does have that more full-bodied, three-dimensional tonality to it. So where does this leave us at the end of this review? Well, I really believe that A10d is a competitive product. For $300 you do get a really decent DAC with a really decent headphone amplifier with plenty of power. It's clearly better than even the best offerings at around $200, which justifies the price hike. On the other hand, is it some sort of a giant killer of market disrupting product? No, it's not, because when you step up a little bit to 440 products such as M500 MK2, you do get a better sounding DAC and even a better sounding headphone amp. If you prioritize headphone use only, you can get topping DX5, which is even better sounding head amp in my opinion, but basically not as good DAC as M500 MK2. Or you can step up to SMSL stack like this one that I've compared it to, and you'll get equal DAC experience with definitely better headphone output experience. But since all of these cost more than Sabaj A10d, I can only conclude that this is actually a good offering for its price. It clicks right where its performance is. So yeah, nothing to get really excited about, but if you good a decent DAC and headphone amp combination at this price point, this is a really good, well-balanced, feature-rich product. And that would be all for today, guys. So if you like this video and if you like what I'm doing on this channel, like, comment, subscribe, become a patron, help me grow and bring you even more interesting reviews. See you next time. Bye.